Welcome to the Cinematic Trail, an AI-generated deep dive conversation into the ever-evolving world of cinematography. From exposure theory to lens choices, from lighting philosophy to creative workflows, we explore the craft, the gear, and the stories behind the frame, one trail marker at a time. Want to take your cinematography to the next level? Explore our online courses and learn more at cinematic.com. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for weekly insights and inspiration. Let's begin the journey.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in. We're looking at insights from a really solid video guide by Chris Tennard from Cinematic today.
That's right. All about choosing camera lenses for filmmaking.
Exactly. And our mission really is to sift through all that info and pull out the key things you need to know to make good choices. Informed decisions.
Yeah, because it's super easy to just drown in the technical specs, right? The numbers, the brand debates.
Totally.
But this guide, it really highlights that picking a lens, it's not just tech, it's, fundamentally creative. It's about achieving a specific vision you have.
It's about intention.
Yeah.
And this guide helps clarify that by kind of boiling it down to three main things that really affect the final look.
Lens speed, focal length, and lens type.
We're going to dig into what Chris says about each of those.
Perfect. Let's start with lens speed then.
So when filmmakers talk about lens speed, what exactly are they focusing on there?
They're really talking about the maximum aperture of the lens, how wide that opening, that iris can get when it's all the way open.
Okay.
And some lenses can just open up way wider than others. That makes a big difference.
And we measure that opening with f-stops, or sometimes t-stops. Chris mentioned a difference there that's actually kind of important for production.
Yes, exactly. This is something pros really pay attention to. F-stops, they measure the light entering the lens just based on the physical size of the opening.
Okay.
But T-stops, that stands for transmission stops. They measure the light that actually makes it through all the glass inside and hits the sensor.
So it accounts for light loss within the lens itself?
Precisely. Different lenses might lose a tiny bit of light internally. So the T-stop gives you a truer reading of the actual light transmission. And that's crucial if you need really consistent exposure, especially, say, if you're swapping between different lenses on a shoot.
Got it. So whether it's f-stop or t-stop, the key thing to remember, and it feels backwards at first, is the smaller the number.
The wider the opening.
And the faster the lens.
Yeah. It really is counterintuitive. As Chris Tennard explains in his video, a 2.8 lens, that's considered pretty fast. A T1.3 lens, that's exceptionally fast. That 1.3 lets in a lot more light than the 2.8.
And there's a rule of thumb in the guide, right? 2.8 and below is generally fast.
Yeah, generally fast. And then 3.5 and above, you're starting to get into slower territory.
Which kind of explains why some zoom lenses, like that 100 to 400 mil example they gave, often have that variable aperture, like 4.5 to 5.6. As you zoom in, the widest opening gets smaller.
Exactly. So they become slower lenses as you extend them, and you just need more light for them to work well, especially at the long end.
Okay, so needing more light for slower lenses is one thing, but what's the big creative advantage of having a fast lens, particularly for filmmaking?
Two main things, really. One's kind of obvious. You perform better in low light. Simple as that. More light hits the sensor, so you can shoot when it's dimmer without, cranking your ISO up into noisy territory. But the second thing, and this is maybe more creatively important, is getting that shallow depth of field.
Yes, the shallow depth of field, that cinematic look everyone talks about. How does the lens speed help with that?
Well, shallow depth of field just means your subject is sharp, right? But the background falls off into that nice, smooth blur really quickly. Chris contrasts that with deep depth of field where everything's sharp front to back. They even call it potentially a flat image, which often isn't as compelling for telling a story.
Yeah, less separation.
Exactly. So a fast lens, because it can open up so wide, gives you the option to create that really shallow look. That wide open aperture is what produces that strong background blur.
It really draws your eye right to the subject. And Chris explains that a 1.3 lens could give you just inches of focus. But that speed comes with a hitch, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Huge creative potential, yes. But shooting wide open on something super fast, like a 1.3, it takes serious precision.
Because the sharp area is so tiny.
So narrow, even tiny movements from your actor or the slightest focus pulling error, and suddenly, their eyes might drift out of focus. It demands careful work. But having that ability to get that extreme look is why filmmakers often chase after fast glass.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense for speed, light, and focus. Let's shift gears then. Talk about focal length. Most people just think zoom.
Right, and it is about how zoomed in or wide you are, sure.
Yeah.
But it's more fundamental than that. It's about the field of view, how the lens renders perspective, and, importantly, background compression.
Okay, so the basic idea is clear.
Yeah.
Short focal length, wider shot, you see more. Long focal length, you're pushed in, things look closer.
Exactly. And the guide gives some typical ranges, like
Right.
under 18 millimeters, say a 14 millimeter, that's wide angle.
Right.
Over 85 millimeter, you're generally in telephoto land.
And they mentioned lenses around, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, feeling natural.
Yeah, that's a common idea. Those focal lengths are often said to approximate how the human eye sees perspective. Less distortion, feels maybe more grounded, good for capturing everyday scenes, conversations naturally.
But you brought up background compression. That's where it gets more interesting than just zooming, where it really shapes the look.
This is where it gets really cool, especially with telephoto lenses. A long lens doesn't just magnify the background, it actually seems to compress the space between your subject and what's behind them.
Flattens the depth.
Yeah, it visually squashes the sense of depth behind your subject.
And when you combine that compression with the shallow depth of field from a fast lens, I remember Chris had a really vivid description for that background texture.
They called it a compressed, gooey canvas texture. Remember that picture example in the video?
Yeah.
As the focal length increased, the background just got pulled forward and blurred into this like painterly mush. It's super effective for making the subject stand out. Creates a really unique, often quite stylized background.
That gooey description really paints a picture.
Yeah.
It shows how choosing focal length can be purely about style, right? Like that director they mentioned who only used long telephotos.
Exactly. She just loved that compressed aesthetic. It was her visual signature. No, obviously that creates practical headaches. Imagine needing a football field just to get a wide shot if you only have a 200 millimeter lens. But the look itself is undeniable. Very distinct, very powerful.
Okay, so speed, focal length. Now the third piece, lens type. This seems more about workflow choices, maybe your camera system, and the sort of personality you want for the image.
Absolutely. Chris goes into a few key types here, starting with maybe the most fundamental choice, prime versus zoom.
Prime's fixed focal length. A 50 millimeter is just. A 50 millimeter, no zooming.
Correct. If you want to reframe your shot with a prime, you physically move the camera closer, further away. Zoom with your feet, as they say.
Which is the big difference from a zoom, like that 2470 they call the workhorse.
Right. Zooms give you that flexibility. Change the focal length within its range, adjust your framing without moving the camera body. Super convenient, especially for fast-moving shoots, documentaries, events.
But Chris seemed pretty strongly in favor of primes, even saying they hardly use their old zoom now. What's the main argument for primes?
It often boils down to the quality of the glass, the optics. Zooms are just more complex mechanically and optically. Lots of moving parts, lots of glass elements.
Right.
So generally speaking, for a zoom to match the sharpness and clarity of a simpler prime lens, it often needs to be much more expensive. Chris felt they saw a clear jump in image quality using primes, like their 50 millimeter. They accepted the inconvenience of moving the camera for that better optical performance.
So you can get amazing high-end zooms, but maybe primes offer better bang for your buck optically, especially at lower price points.
Often, yes, that tends to be the trade-off. Flexibility versus potentially pure image quality for the cost.
Okay. What about other types? Chris talked about cine lens, built for cinema.
Yeah, they often look beefier, more industrial, larger housings.
What makes them special beyond just looking the part?
Key things are designed for filmmakers. The most obvious is probably the focus ring. Cine lenses usually have these large, really smooth focus rings with a very long throw, like 300 degrees of rotation sometimes.
For really fine control over focus pulls.
Exactly. It allows for super precise, smooth, and repeatable focus adjustments while you're rolling. Absolute critical for professional focus pulling.
And I assume the glass quality is top-notch, like with high-end primes.
Definitely. Cine lenses are engineered for the best possible optical performance. That means better polishing on the glass elements, fewer internal imperfections. All that results in a cleaner light path, fewer issues like color fringing or unwanted distortion. As Chris Tenard explains in his video, that level of glass quality can really elevate the work.
Makes sense. Then there are anamorphic lenses. Very specific purpose, very specific look.
Right. Their main job is to let you shoot in those really wide aspect ratios, like 2.35 or 2.39 to 1. They essentially squeeze a wider image onto a standard sensor.
and then you de-squeeze it in editing to get the wide picture back.
Exactly. And that whole process, plus how they're built, creates some very characteristic visual traits.
Like what?
Things like a softer, sometimes more oval-shaped bokeh, the out-of-focus areas. You might see some curvature or distortion on straight lines near the edges of the frame. And famously, those distinctive horizontal lens flares when a bright light hits the lens.
The J.J. Abrams flare.
Kind of. Yeah, that look is very strongly associated with big, cinematic, often high-budget productions. It's a stylistic choice.
And finally, vintage lenses. Seems like they're having a moment.
Oh, huge surge in popularity. You see them everywhere now. Indies, blockbusters.
Chris mentioned these are often based on older lens designs, sometimes replicas of lenses from, like, decades ago. They mentioned Russian lenses.
Yeah, things like old Helios lenses, for example.
And the interesting thing is, filmmakers seem to choose them because of their imperfections. Why choose a flawed lens?
Because the imperfections are the personality. That's the whole point. Unlike modern lenses, which are often engineered for, like, clinical perfection.
Right, sharp edge to edge, no flare.
Exactly. Vintage lenses, with their, let's say, less refined glass or older coating formulas, they make light do interesting things. As light passes through, it might scatter differently, bloom more, create these really pronounced, characterful lens flares, or introduce subtle color shifts, or give the whole image a kind of softer, dreamier feel, that vintage glow. You're not picking them hoping they're perfect. You're picking them for those beautiful, sometimes unpredictable visual quirks they add. It's about character.
So bringing it all together, speed, focal length, these different types, the guide really emphasizes that it's not just about specs. It's mixing those technical aspects with your creative goals.
That's absolutely the main takeaway. Every single lens, just because of how its glass is ground, how it's coated, how it's built, it has its own unique voice, its own personality.
Right.
Is it super sharp and clean? Or does it have a bit of, soul? Maybe softer edges, maybe cool flares, maybe a weird color cast. That personality fundamentally shapes the final image.
Which really means there's no single best lens.
Not even close. Chris is super clear on this. The right lens is just the one that works best for your project, your style, the specific place you're shooting, and the exact results you're aiming for.
And that core advice from Chris seems so simple but so powerful. Let the story lead.
Yeah. Your creative vision, what you're trying to say with the film or video, that should guide your technical choices, including the lens you pick.
Yeah, the practical side. Good lenses aren't cheap. They can be really expensive. Chris had some smart advice there.
Oh yeah, very practical advice. Renting. Especially when you're starting out or want to try something different. Buying a lens, it's a big commitment.
And you can't really know if it fits your style just from reading reviews.
Exactly. Renting lets you actually use different lenses, test different speeds, different focal lengths, different types like anamorphic or vintage, on your own shoots, in your lighting conditions.
See how they feel, how they perform for real.
Yeah. Figure out what actually works for your workflow, your look, your budget, before you drop serious cash on buying one.
It's probably the smartest way to experiment and learn without, potentially making a very expensive mistake.
Hands down. Great way to build your knowledge and your confidence.
Okay, so we've taken this deep dive. We've looked at lens speed, how it affects light and depth of field. We've explored focal length, shaping the frame, compressing space. And we've touched on the different personalities of lens types. Primes, zooms, anamorphic, vintage.
And tying all those technical ideas back to your creative intention, that's where the magic happens.
Because your lens, it does way more than just record what's in front of it.
It fundamentally shapes how your audience experiences the story you're telling, how they see it, how they feel it.
So the takeaway seems to be, take this knowledge, maybe rent some different options.
Experiment, get hands-on.
And trust your own eyes to find the lenses that really help tell your story the way you want it told. That's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for the great conversation.
Yeah, really great insights today. Thanks for tuning in and spending some time with us.
Thank you for joining us on the Cinematic Trail. We hope today's journey sparked new ideas and sharpened your eye behind the lens. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and as always, happy filming.